According to the court records, the pastor she worked for offered her 0 medical accommodations during her cancer treatment. He targeted her for aggressive romantic advances. When she rejected him, he told her that God gave her cancer to teach her a lesson. This was the mindset that was hiding behind those healing altars. You may have seen that megachurch pastor Robert Morris recently spent 6 months in an Oklahoma jail after pleading guilty to child sexual abuse charges. But the mainstream headlines completely gloss over the fact that this problem isn't just about Robert Morris. Behind it all, there was a sinister machine that was engineered to make Morris's abuse possible. This week, I am pulling back the curtain on the multi-million-dollar corporation that is Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas, and its founder, Robert Morris. I bet you haven't heard of Gateway's Kairos Freedom Ministry with 13-hour-long days of people receiving trauma counseling without a single licensed mental health care professional involved, including children. I bet you haven't heard about their classes promising to teach people how to hear prophecies, but refusing to let them share any prophecy they hear that's about church leaders. And I bet you haven't heard about their healing ministry, promising miraculous recovery from illness if your heart was aligned with the church. We're going to talk about institutional culture, the cover-ups that have been happening for years, and the shady business practices of the church. I'm going to address Robert Morris's wife, Debbie, and her teachings that increased church income and controlled the women in the church. We'll reveal the use of unpaid, overworked volunteers and even a class action lawsuit filed by church members because of tithe misallocation. Then we'll talk about what needs to happen to hold these churches accountable and prevent this abuse in the future. This one is a personal one for me as somebody who has experienced Gateway and has friends who have been deep in the trenches there. So you'll get to hear the inside scoop. You won't want to miss a single second. So get ready. Do you want to hear something awful? Welcome to Do You Want to Hear Something Awful? I am your host, Allison. On this podcast, we investigate some of the most terrifying, corrupt, shocking things happening in our world and dismantle them one piece at a time. But we also talk about ways you can directly fight back to make our society less terrible. And so we don't all walk out of here depressed, I always make sure to end with 3 pieces of positive news. My goal is that this podcast would not only be educational entertainment, but also empower you to take action to create a better world. If you have any of your own positivity you'd like to share or any topics you want me to cover, feel free to email us at iwanttohearsomethingawful@gmail.com. Before we go any further, I want to issue a content warning here that we will be talking about sexual assault, about suicide, and about misogyny. So if any of these are topics that you find triggering, feel free to go listen to some of my other episodes that might be more interesting to you. Before we get into Morris's downfall, let's set the stage and discuss the financial situation at Gateway. Gateway always encouraged people to tithe, give, and volunteer, and promised blessings from God in exchange for generosity, which is something called the prosperity gospel. But after Morris's court case, new information came to light and revealed that the church didn't just start scrambling its books recently. These financial shenanigans had actually been going on for years. Gateway has always relied on free volunteer labor to maintain its massive operations. The church offered volunteer lounges with snacks like grapes and cheese and the occasional volunteer thank you event like concerts by the Fort Worth Symphony at their huge Southlake auditorium in exchange for your volunteer labor. You would think that the church relied on this labor because of lack of funds, right? However, court records recently revealed that Robert Morris was pursuing a ginormous retirement payout, $1 million up front, $800,000 annually until age 70, and $600,000 a year for the rest of his and his wife's lives. So they had money to pay the people who were volunteering. They were only using volunteers so that Robert Morris could stack up his retirement funds. The audacity of this pastor to demand millions in tithe funds at the same time the church was laying off 30 to 40% of its employees after his scandal increasing their requests for volunteers, just shows how much corporate greed was disguised by spirituality and good intentions the whole time. In 2024, 4 church members filed a class action lawsuit against Gateway because of the church's misallocation of their tithes. Morris always promised that 15% of all weekly tithes would go directly to global missions and Jewish ministry partners. He always preached that if a member was unhappy with how their donations were used, they could get their money back. Under Texas law, this verbal agreement was a binding contract, and it came to light that the church completely breached this contract when members started demanding transparency and refunds after Robert Morris's scandal broke. Gateway brought in an estimated $100 million a year in revenue. So 15% of that should be about $15 million that well-meaning families believed was going to support global communities. But in the class action lawsuit, it came to light that this 15% did not exist at all. Enter Alan Shoulders. Alan Shoulders was a seasoned, certified public accountant and retired partner from a Big Four accounting firm. Gateway hired him in 2011 to serve as executive pastor of global ministries. They brought in this financial expert to run the exact department that this $15 million was missing from. When an independent auditor looked at the books, he started noticing massive red flags. Robert Morris was publicly boasting that Gateway had sent millions of dollars overseas. But Alan Shoulders at this time said that he had never witnessed more than $3 million a year make it to global missions. Out of $100 million a year, that means that $12 million was vanishing into thin air. Even worse, Shoulders began to discover a string of completely unexplained withdrawals from the Gateway Global Ministries fund balance totaling to $1.5 million. As a professional CPA, he was worried about his license, and so he went straight to the top and sat down with Senior Pastor Robert Morris and Executive Senior Pastor Tom Lane. He basically told them, either we address these financial regularities or I'm out. And how did these men of God react? You would expect them to launch an internal investigation or audit the missing millions, but no. They said, okay, we'll accept your resignation. And they accepted his resignation on the spot, escorted him out, and then buried his concerns intentionally for over a decade. When the scandal finally broke and members started demanding to see the books, Gateway's PR machine did not know what to do and claimed they had been doing independent audits since 2005. But Alan Shoulders at this point came forward and completely blew that claim out of the water. He revealed that during his entire tenure, Gateway did not do a single financial audit. They did a basic financial review, which is a completely different animal and way less detailed. Reviews are just a series of surface-level questions, and they're not designed to catch errors, investigate records, or detect fraud. Audits are made to detect fraud, and those were never done since 2005. Robert Morris spent years telling his congregation that he backed his ministry with a money-back guarantee. He literally told people, if you're not satisfied at the end of the year, I'll give you your money back. After the abuse scandals leaked, hundreds of members tried to take him up on that promise, and suddenly Gateway's high-priced, high-caliber legal team began to sing a different tune and sent out a bunch of letters saying, sorry, legal definitions of nonprofits mean that your tithe was an unconditional gift, and giving it back would violate federal law. So they used the pulpit to extract cash, and then they used a handpicked board of elders to silence this CPA, Alan Shoulders, who had caught the missing millions. And then they used tax law as a shield to keep the money after the scandal. It makes you wonder, was it ever a ministry or was it a business? Now that we know the financial motivations behind covering up Morris's crime, let's get into the crime itself. In June 2024, Cindy Clemishire came forward and revealed that Robert Morris had systematically abused her in the 1980s, starting when she was just 12 years old and he was a 22-year-old traveling evangelist. When this broke, Gateway's board of elders went into immediate damage control and claimed that they were shocked. They said that back in 2005, Morris told them he had an extramarital affair, but he left out the very minor detail that his partner was a 12-year-old child. But then, when the legal paperwork started dropping and being forced out of the woodwork, the church's story completely unraveled. When Robert Morris resigned, he was laser focused on his money. He engaged in a multi-million-dollar legal dispute with the church, and to save their own skin, Gateway fought back. That is where the real receipts were leaked. Morris's lawyers filed documents basically saying, "Stop pretending that you didn't know." According to court filings, Gateway elders knew the exact facts of his relationship with Cindy as early as 2005, and without a doubt, by August of 2007. How do we know? Because in 2007, Cindy's attorney sent a formal demand letter to the Board of Elders explicitly detailing the abuse and explicitly stating that she was 12 years old. It gets worse. In 2011, an anonymous whistleblower emailed Gateway leadership threatening to tell the media what was going on. Morris drafted a public confession to read to the congregation where he admitted she was under 13, but church lawyers and leadership advised him to bury it immediately and never talk about it again. They even offered Cindy a $25,000 settlement and a non-disclosure agreement to buy her lifelong silence, and kudos to her for rejecting it. When an internal investigation by an outside law firm finally wrapped up, the head elder had to stand in front of the congregation and tell them the truth. That multiple church members, employees, and elders knew about the age of the victim for years and chose every day to protect the man up top. Think about the psychological warfare involved here. For 2 decades, these elders watched Robert Morris build a global megachurch, collect millions in tithes, and preach about morality, all while holding a folder in their desk drawers that detailed his crimes against a 12-year-old. They happily took a paycheck from a power structure designed to protect the wolf and silence the lamb. Debbie Morris, Robert Morris's wife, is no passive bystander. In fact, she was instrumental in building the culture at Gateway that allowed this to go on. Debbie hosted an annual Pink Conference for women and was really involved in the women's ministry, teaching prayerful, graceful submission to one's husband. If you look at the book she released in 2013 called The Blessed Woman, Learning About Grace from the Women of the Bible, her framework is really disturbing. Debbie writes that a woman's ability to trust God's authority is a direct reflection of her ability to trust the authority of leadership. In the context of Gateway, this was weaponized to mean that if a woman questioned a male pastor, an elder, or a husband, she was spiritually deficient and failing to trust God. Secondly, the reason why the title of the book is Learning About Grace is because the book heavily pushes a theology where refusing to immediately forgive someone who harms you is a toxic sin that will poison your body and cause physical disease. Under this doctrine, victims of abuse were pressured to release the other person from blame, to leave the justice entirely in God's hands. And you can see how this mindset plays into what happened with Cindy Clemishire. Debbie created a culture in which if she had spoken up against the abuse happening, she would have been sinning and disgraced. And so she was able to spiritually blackmail survivors into keeping quiet under the guise of avoiding physical illness and avoiding developing a bitter root, which is what Gateway's healing rooms that I mentioned earlier were all about. Cindy Clemishire's defamation lawsuit hinges on the fact that Robert and Debbie Morris tried to frame the abuse of a 12-year-old as a mutual consensual affair. When the story broke in June 2024, Robert Morris released a public statement admitting he was involved in inappropriate sexual behavior with a young lady. Debbie contacted Cindy early on and told her that she forgave Cindy, again going back to her book, talking about forgiveness, and secondly, treating a brutal crime against a 12-year-old as a mere consensual moral indiscretion that Cindy wanted to happen, that Cindy was part of this quote-unquote sin. This echoes the framework that she wrote about in her book, and to me, her book feels like one big Freudian slip. By framing it as an affair, the Morris family and Gateway's leadership implied that sexual acts perpetrated against someone are consensual, no matter the age. Cindy testified that for nearly 40 years, Robert and Debbie Morris tried to rewrite the story to blame her and protect Robert's multi-million-dollar megachurch brand. This victim blaming is exactly why a Dallas County judge denied Debbie and the elders' attempts to throw the case out. Gateway still has a deeply hypocritical double standard when it comes to women on staff. On their website and on paper, you'll see plenty of women listed with titles like pastor or minister. They'll run women's ministries, worship teams, children's programs. The church desperately relies on these female staff and massive armies of volunteers that are women to do the heavy lifting of keeping the campus running. And on the surface, they seem super supportive of women in ministry and very progressive. But according to the official Gateway Church bylaws, women are entirely barred from holding actual institutional power. The church's governance dictates that all final decision-making power, financial oversight, and disciplinary control belong exclusively to the board of elders and the senior lead pastor. Women are not allowed in either of these positions. Gateway operates under strict complementarian theology, meaning they believe that the office of elder or lead overseer is biblically restricted to men. A woman at Gateway can be given the title of pastor, but she is not actually allowed in any of the executive rooms where the money is allocated, where the audits are, and they are allowed to be the face of the ministry, but never the managers of the machine. And I always wondered if Gateway would have been able to hide this for as many years as they did if women had been in those boardrooms, hearing these conversations, hearing about Cindy Clemishire. You have to question whether that's one major reason why women were never, and are still never, allowed power at Gateway. Few people know about Gateway's Freedom Ministry and its multi-day intensive called Kairos Weekend. Kairos is marketed as a sacred time set apart for inner healing, to break generational curses and gain deliverance from demonic oppression. But during the actual service, it looks a lot less like a spiritual retreat, and there's a lot of textbook psychological coercion. First of all, when you arrive at Kairos, you're cut off from the outside world. In many variations of this retreat, phones, smartwatches, and electronics are confiscated. And you have a 13-hour-a-day schedule with emotionally intense sessions and become very exhausted. And exhaustion is one of the fastest ways to break down human psychological defenses. So when you're exhausted and cut off from your normal support systems, your brain becomes hypersuggestible. That is when they wait to start the trauma dumping. During sessions, participants are put into small groups and pressured to confess their absolute darkest secrets, deepest shames, past sexual histories, and childhood traumas. The environment manufactures an intense emotional crisis. You'll see people crying, hyperventilating, screaming. People will be passing out. My parents had me attend the children's version of Kairos, where we were offered healing hugs at the altar after sharing about traumatic childhood experiences. The healing hugs were given by adults, and they were prefaced by a pastor, a male pastor, to the youth, saying specifically that this would not be a sexual event. One of my friends shared that she told Kairos staff that she planned to drink bleach to unalive herself before she came to the retreat. It was never reported, and no action was taken other than telling her to attend church more often and talk to her pastor. The people guiding you through this intense psychological process are not licensed therapists, they are not certified trauma counselors, and they are not mental health professionals. They are unpaid church volunteers who took a 4-week course over video called Introduction to Freedom Ministry. You have completely untrained, unvetted, biased volunteers poking holes in vulnerable people, offering only spiritual platitudes as a bandage for trauma. During the deliverance and inner healing sessions, participants are taught that all negative emotions like anger, depression, anxiety, or doubt are not normal human responses to a bad environment and instead are indicators of demonic oppression or generational curses. If you are unhappy with how you are being treated at the church, or if you feel uneasy about leadership, then Freedom Ministry teaches you that the problem isn't the church, it's your spirit of rebellion and an unhealed wound in your own soul. They use the Kairos weekend to get you to lay your entire life bare and then take your confessions and use them against you. On the final day, the emotional roller coaster turns into extreme love bombing. You're welcomed into an inner circle, given a symbol of your freedom, and told to maintain this spiritual high. And to do so, you must stay completely aligned with the church, follow what it says. They isolate you during the service, break you down, bring out your vulnerabilities, and then tell you that the church is your only cure. Gateway hosted healing nights that not many people know about, where people could line up at the altar, get pastors to lay hands on them, and share testimonies of miraculous recoveries from chronic illness, from cancer, from physical disabilities. The pastors paint a picture of a God who is handing out physical wellness like a gift with an implied requirement. Do you remember Debbie Morris's book where she taught that unforgiveness causes physical sickness? Well, this healing ministry was less about miraculous healing and more about identifying what spiritually was holding you back from your healing. And in many cases, this was unforgiveness, past trauma, or so-called generational curses. Church members were taught that staying involved in the church and honoring authority was a direct reflection of how you honor God. And when you honor God, God heals you. In the Gateway ecosystem, physical healing is also explicitly tied to your spiritual compliance and financial output. When they say stay involved with the church, they mean tithing, because tithing was routinely preached at Gateway. Robert Morris and the teaching team at Gateway routinely preach that if you aren't getting healed, the breakdown is on your end, not God's. The ministry framework implied that chronic sickness, pain, diagnoses are the result of hidden, unconfessed sin, a lack of faith, or a failure to properly tithe. They would tell desperate, suffering people that they could unlock their physical healing by opening their wallets, working harder for the church, or working through their traumas and unsolved unforgiveness, even against people at the church, with church leaders. Gateway settled a massive, unrelated lawsuit brought by a former employee that exposed this healing culture. The plaintiff was a woman hired as an administrative assistant right after completing treatment for cancer. According to the court records, the pastor she worked for offered her zero medical accommodations or Christian empathy during her cancer treatment. Instead, he targeted her for aggressive, unwanted romantic advances during one of the most vulnerable times of her life. When she rejected him, he told her that God gave her cancer to teach her a lesson. Let the cruelty of that sink in. This was the mindset that was hiding behind those healing altars. While they stand on a stage telling the public that their ministry is a place of supernatural restoration, behind closed doors they use sickness as a weapon to control people psychologically. If you can frame physical suffering as a divine punishment, it keeps you compliant. If you are healthy, it is because you followed the rules and paid your tithes. If you're sick, if you're abused, it's because you're spiritually deficient, and that makes it your fault, not something that the church has to fix or help. If you didn't think that this was crazy enough, wait until you find out about Gateway's prophetic nights. Auditoriums were filled with countless people hoping to get a prophetic word from pastors who were receiving messages from the Holy Spirit. Gateway set up prophetic teams across all their campuses and offered training classes with titles like Everyday Prophetic. They still do, by the way. They tell the congregation that these teams are a pipeline to hear a direct, fresh word straight from the mouth of God for your life. But if you are looking at the training manuals used by Everyday Prophetic and the way prophetic words are actually handled, you'll see that there's an element of behavioral containment involved. The very first rule of Gateway's prophetic training isn't how to hear God. It's about submitting your prophecy to pastoral authority. They explicitly teach that if you receive a prophetic word, a vision, or a dream about the church or its leadership, you cannot tell anybody else about it publicly. You have to take it to a male pastor elder first. And I think it's ironic because I wonder if they were afraid that somebody would get a vision about what Robert Morris had done and expose what was going on. And the elders were so afraid of someone finding out that they made this rule. How funny is it to think that they were afraid of God telling on them? If a member has a gut feeling, a moral check, a spiritual intuition, or any sort of inkling that something is profoundly wrong with Robert Morris or the money management, the warning is neutralized by pastoral authority, and the prophetic framework tells the member if your word challenges leadership, it's out of order. It's a spirit of rebellion, not the Holy Spirit. It's not a true prophetic word unless it aligns with the church's teachings. On the flip side, they weaponized positive prophecy to reward compliance. When the leader wanted to build a new multi-million-dollar campus and hire the executive pastor's child, guess what they did? The prophetic team was deployed to validate it. Pastors stood on the stage and claimed that God told them that this was a season of divine acceleration or that a breakthrough was coming and people should stay loyal and that they were directed to build this new multi-million-dollar satellite campus. They used the phrase, God told me, to make executive business decisions seem completely unchallengeable to the congregation. How could an ordinary volunteer question a budget layout or administrative layoff if the board of elders claims that they got the blueprints directly from heaven? This is a psychological trap. Using the prophetic ministry to basically validate their corporate expansion and also subvert member doubts about leadership is horrifying. It's truly awful. Perhaps the eeriest part of Gateway is that on the outside, it seems like such a happy place. You would never know that this was going on. Spiritual authority was tied to a facade of happiness and mainstream marketability. Looking at the staff members and churchgoers, you would never know that so much darkness lays beneath the surface of optimism, generosity, smiling greeters, their cute little cafe. The word performative doesn't even begin to describe sheer scale of this operation. The church spends millions of dollars on broadcast-grade video teams, Hollywood-caliber lighting rigs, multi-camera live-switching setups, and holiday musicals that were said to be on par with Broadway productions. They even collaborated with TV networks like Daystar and hosted large volunteering events and invited the media to make sure they were in the public eye. But if you wanted to serve on any role that faced the public, especially the main worship team, you had to have the look. The culture encourages a polished, mainstream, trendy aesthetic. Even on the recording of one of their worship albums, they brought in a lot of volunteers and sat them in view of the camera and gave them a specific dress code with a specific color palette and instructions on what to do and what not to do during the worship recording album in order to be videoed by the camera. Women especially were expected to maintain a manicured, feminine, commercially attractive appearance. If your style didn't match the branding of the megachurch, you were managed out of the spotlight. I dare you to Google the Gateway worship team even today and look at them. How many people of color are there? What's going on with their outfits, their makeup, their everything, their hair? It's all the same as each other. It's very manufactured. So how do we break through this dazzling facade that pulls thousands of people in a year? How do we hold a corporation like Gateway accountable when its entire infrastructure is designed to bury the truth and protect the board? You have to use two tools that megachurches actually fear, which is the law and money, which ironically are the same tools that businesses fear. Megachurches have legal privileges that they can use under the guise of religious freedom. They don't have to file IRS Form 990s like regular nonprofits, meaning that they are not required to report their executive salaries, private jet usage, real estate acquisitions, or things like where that $15 million went. They rely on this tax exemption to hide what's going on, but it doesn't protect them from fraud or defamation, and that is exactly why Cindy Clemishire went for a defamation lawsuit. accountability did not come from any church committee or superficial elder confession. It came through that defamation lawsuit in Dallas County against Robert Morris, Debbie Morris, and the elders. And when the church tried to use religious exemptions to get that case thrown out, the judge denied them and ruled the lawsuit could move forward. And at the same time, 4 courageous church members hit them where it hurts: a class action lawsuit for financial fraud. The church desperately tried to stall and push those retirement disputes into a private arbitration, but the federal court system forced those receipts out into the daylight. So true accountability happens when we stop treating megachurches like sacred altars or churches that are tax exempt and start treating them like the high revenue businesses and companies they actually are. So here's what you should do. Stop relying on church media networks for updates. Look at organizations like Ministry Watch or the Trinity Foundation, because they spend decades tracking private jets, shell companies, and executive enrichment schemes in the megachurch world. You will be surprised by what you find. Advocate to make megachurches with over a certain amount of income subject to IRS Form 990s, and donate to organizations of your choosing rather than tithing directly to the church. You can choose where you want your money to go rather than relying on a church to donate to an organization they might never be. And always believe victims. Report the crimes, speak up. Think about this. All it would have taken all of these years for Cindy Clemishire to get her closure and healing is if one single person who had known what was going on stood up for her and reported what happened. Okay, that was really heavy, so let's end with some positive news. First of all, a Nobel Prize winning chemist has recently discovered a groundbreaking machine capable of harvesting water directly from the air in the world's hottest climates. And with all the issues of access to clean water and concerns about data centers these days, this could be an amazing discovery. Second of all, the UN voted in favor that countries have a legal obligation to address climate change now. And lastly, if you've ever wanted a 4-day work week, companies in Australia have been testing it, and almost half of the businesses in the trial reported an increase in productivity. So this could be pretty good for implementing it here in the US. Oh, and one more I almost forgot. There was a gene analysis with a DNA test called Prosigna that was recently developed that can accurately detect whether chemotherapy is necessary for breast cancer. And it could spare over 2/3 of patients aged 40 and older the world of side effects from unnecessary chemotherapy. It's a new study out of UCLA. You should look into it. And on a personal level, I am really excited for the summer weather. That's where I live, and I want to learn how to fish soon, and I'm really excited for that. That's all for this episode. Make sure to come back to hear more awful things if you dare. In the show notes, I've included all of my sources. I do my best to fact check the sources and consolidate information, but if I missed anything or got anything wrong, or if you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out at iwanttohearsomethingawful@gmail.com and give us a rating to help us grow. We'll see you next time.